Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to go over kingdom fungi. And this picture right here happens to be my favorite fungus. When I first learned that its name was called dead man's fingers, that just grabbed me. I just thought it was the coolest fungus. Again, they're not literally the fingers of a dead person, but if you use your imagination, it kind of looks like you can picture the zombie apocalypse where you have a dead corpse trying to break free from being buried, and here's its fingers reaching above the ground. So that was kind of that did it. That was my favorite. From there on, this is my favorite fungus. But moving on, let's learn some basics about kingdom fungi. Okay, so let's look at a few basic features about fungus. So there's fungus among us. Here we go. One of the more common misconceptions about fungus is that because fungus kind of grow in the ground, and some of them even resemble plants, there's often the misconception that fungi are photosynthetic like plants, and that's just not true. Fungi, kingdom fungi, 100% of them are heterotrophs. There's not one exception to that rule. So all fungus, 100% of fungus, are heterotrophs. They do not perform photosynthesis. They do not have chloroplasts or chlorophyll. So they obtain their food from others. Many of them are decomposers, and they obtain their food from dead organisms, and some of them can be parasites, but none of them are photosynthetic. We look at this poor fish here in the picture. This fish has a fungus infection. Look at the fins of the fish. You can see that the fins of the fish are rotting away. That's because there's a fungus that is a parasite to this particular fish. And the way fungi feed is the fungus cells. The cells of the fungus will release digestive enzymes externally. That means the fungus will release enzymes onto whatever it is they're growing. If the fungus is growing on dead leaves, then the fungus will release enzymes onto the dead leaves. In the picture, fungus are living amongst the cells of the fish. So the fungus are releasing enzymes onto the cells of the fish. It's causing the fish cells to digest. And then once the fungus digests the fish externally, the fungus will then literally just absorb the nutrients back into its body. And one thing also to mention is that fungi have a cell wall made of chitin, which is a polysaccharide. Now the reason for this picture here is that at a time in science history, fungus were thought to have more similarities to kingdom plants. Fungus and plants were thought to have more in common. Well, when we chemically analyze the two, we actually find the opposite, that fungus have more in common to animals. The picture shows an insect breaking free from its exoskeleton here. Well, exoskeletons of insects are made from chitin, the same material that makes up the cell wall of fungus. Chitin is also what makes up our toenails and our fingernails. So animals have body parts made of chitin, as do fungi. That's one reason why we're pretty certain that fungus and animals are more related to one another. Here we have the above ground reproductive structure of a fungus, and a lot of this video we're going to talk about how fungi reproduce. And so the above ground structure is what we call a fruiting body. We're going to go into that in just a few moments. The fruiting body produces little tiny reproductive cells called spores, and the spores are often released into the wind or into the rain to grow into a new fungus. So we're going to talk more about asexual and sexual reproduction of fungi in just a few moments. So I hope you recognize this picture. It shows the 6 kingdoms of life. If you look at the purple bubble in the middle, the Protista kingdom, one of the things we mentioned earlier in the school year is that there's a category of Protista that are called fungus-like Protista, the slime molds and the water molds. Well, we're pretty confident in our understanding of evolution of life on Earth to say that the fungus-like Protista were the ancestors to today's modern fungi. Just like the animal-like Protista are the ancestors to today's modern animals, and the plant-like Protista are the ancestors to today's modern day plants. So when we look at the basic structure, here we have a reproductive cell called a spore. And we'll be talking about spores more throughout these notes, but a spore has been released from one fungus and it just landed on the ground. Well, the spore is going to multiply and divide and grow. And so when the spore grows, little branches, little cells start to branch out in various directions, and we call these individual branchings of cells, we call them hyphae. And as the hyphae grow, they will release digestive enzymes and absorb the nutrients, and as they take in more energy, they grow and become even larger. So the hyphae begin to branch and make more branches and make more branches. And over time, the amount of hyphae just multiplies and multiplies and becomes larger and larger and larger. And what accumulates underground is what we call the body of the fungus. The body of the fungus accumulates underground, and there's a vocabulary word for the body of a fungus. It's called the mycelium. So in the picture, you can see that the overall mycelium is made from dozens and dozens of hyphae. I mean, in reality, this is just, again, an artist's drawing. In reality, thousands and thousands and probably millions of hyphae make up the overall body called the mycelium. And this is all underground for the most part. And I say underground for the most part because when fungi reproduce, an above ground structure called a fruiting body appears. The fruiting body grows upward from the ground. The fruiting body grows upward from the mycelium. And the fruiting body is the reproductive structure. Inside of the fruiting body are little spore-producing structures. And these spore-producing structures will undergo meiosis to create spores. Spores, if they're created by meiosis, you should know that spores would be haploid. Meiosis is the process where haploid cells are created. And so what we're going to focus on for the rest of these notes is how are fungi classified? Well, one of the defining feature I want you to know is that fungus are classified based on their fruiting bodies. So let me show you a couple pictures of some fruiting bodies. So here's a fruiting body. If you use your imagination, this kind of reminds us of Super Mario and the power-up option. And here's kind of a more typical looking fungus that we're used to seeing. So now that I've distracted you with a couple pictures of fungi, try to label these. From the previous diagram, pause the video because I'm going to go over the answer in 3, 2, 1. So area A would be the above ground structure called the fruiting body. Area B would be the large underground mass known as the mycelium. We haven't really learned what area C is called. The diagram we saw earlier was just labeled the spore-producing structure. Well, the spore-producing structure is what's different between the various kinds of fungi. Sac fungi have different spore-producing structures. Zygote fungi have different spore-producing structures. Club fungi have different spore-producing structures. So we're going to learn more about the spore-producing structures as we go through this video. And area D, the two lines are pointing to individual hyphae. So there's the general structure of a fungus. So let's go over how fungi reproduce asexually. It all begins when a sex cell called a spore lands on the ground. So in our animation, that black dot represents a spore. And what I want you to know about spores is that they're haploid. If you remember, haploid means it's a cell that has half the total number of chromosomes. Sex cells in general typically are haploid. And so the spore is a reproductive cell of a fungus. It lands on the ground. The next step, that spore is going to grow a bunch of hyphae, those little branches called hyphae, and the hyphae are going to branch and make more branches and make more branches, and this big, massive collection of hyphae is going to begin to accumulate. Again, we call this big collection of hyphae the mycelium. This is the body of the fungus. And what I want you to know is that all of this is haploid because it grew from the haploid spore. So far the fungus is a haploid organism. And then what happens is an above ground fruiting body is going to grow, and inside of the fruiting body are more of those reproductive cells called spores. So the fruiting bodies grow above ground. Again, everything right now is haploid. And inside of those fruiting bodies, spores are released. And notice in the animation, even the spores are haploid. So asexually, when we look at the asexual life cycle of a fungus, it's a haploid organism. Now, knowing that this is a cycle, the cycle would then repeat because some of those spores will land on the ground, create their own hyphae, and the process simply continues. One organism reproducing more and more and more others. That's what we mean by asexual reproduction. Well, let's look at the sexual form of reproduction. Sexually, I'm going to show two different fungal spores, and I'm going to color code them. So there's the spore of fungus A, the yellow spore. It just landed on the ground. And I want to mention that spores are haploid. So here comes a spore, a blue spore represented from fungus B. So two individuals here. But again, both spores are haploid, nothing out of the ordinary there. Both spores are going to grow a bunch of hyphae, and the hyphae are going to make branches and make more hyphae, and the hyphae of the hyphae are going to branch to make more hyphae, and a large underground mass of hyphae accumulates, and we call this large underground mass mycelium. Watch the animation. In the animation, a blue mass of mycelium just accumulated, and now a yellow mass of mycelium just accumulated. So two fungi yellow and fungi blue. Now notice where they're connecting in the middle. So what happens here is the hyphae of the two fungi are going to fuse together. And so when a haploid hyphae in yellow fuses with the haploid hyphae in blue, haploid fuses to haploid. Haploid plus haploid, I hope you know, makes diploid. And so the diploid part of the fungus now grows from that. That green, yellow combined to blue makes green. That's why I chose those colors. That's the diploid fungus. That's a new individual. That's a new fungus organism that was created from the two haploids. And as the process continues, that green diploid mycelium, that green diploid fungus, is going to produce its own fruiting body. Watch the animation. Above ground, a fruiting body is created. Now, all of that is even diploid. The fruiting body is diploid, but what it releases are spores. And when the spores are released, I hope you know that the spores are haploid. So watch the animation. So a bunch of spores are released, and look at that green spore that landed there on the left. That spore is haploid. So if I were to ask you, if I were to ask you, the green haploid dot, the green haploid spore came from that diploid above ground fruiting body. So if it started diploid but ended haploid, I hope you know meiosis must have been the key division there. And finishing off this particular animation here, that green haploid spore will create hyphae, and the hyphae will branch to make a big mass of mycelium, and the cycle repeats itself. Looking at a category of fungus called the bread molds. Bread molds often decompose dead matter, and we often discover that when we're really in the mood for a sandwich. You really want, that deli meat that you really like. You get out the deli meat, you get out the cheese, you get out all the condiments, the mayonnaise, the mustard, you cut up some tomatoes, maybe some lettuce, maybe some onions, and then you reach into the bag of bread, and the bread's all moldy, or the crust is all moldy. Well, then we face that decision. How bad do you want that sandwich? Do you just cut off the moldy crust and continue to make the sandwich, or do you throw the bread away and go to the store and buy a new loaf of bread? We've all had that dilemma. What have you chosen? Anyways, moving on to the bread molds. The bread molds can reproduce sexually or asexually. In the animation, you can see spores are being released. Again, spores are haploid. So haploid spores are being released into the air, and maybe the spores will land on another loaf of bread. Maybe they'll land with an open window. Maybe the spores will drift through the air and outside and land in the dirt. One thing I want to mention about bread molds is that they're a great example of a mutualistic organism. Bread molds have a mutualistic relationship often with plants. There's a special kind of bread mold by the name of mycorrhizae, and it's a great example of a mutualistic relationship with plants. Mycorrhiza is a fungus, and the plant live in mutualism, a relationship where they both benefit. What I'm going to show you in a moment is that the fungus, the mycorrhizae fungus, benefits because it obtains sugars from the plant. The plant does photosynthesis, makes its own sugar, and the fungus can obtain and take some of that sugar. The plant will often obtain phosphorus from the hyphae of the fungus. Plants need phosphorus and other nutrients. I guess phosphorus is not the only nutrient, but it's a very important one. And so plants grow better with these fungi. And you can even see it in the picture. Look at the picture. It's a great example of this. The plants labeled without in the picture, these are the control group. These plants have been grown without the mycorrhiza fungi in their roots. And the plants labeled with, these are plants that have been grown with the mycorrhiza fungi in the roots. So the conclusion is pretty straightforward. The conclusion is that plants and crops tend to grow better with this mycorrhizae fungi. And this is something that agriculturalists and farmers are definitely taking notice and trying to incorporate into their growing of crops. So here's a nice little cute little poster I found for why do your plants need mycorrhiza fungi. And if you just read through it, if the picture is a little blurry, I hope not. Mycorrhiza fungi are beneficial and they form a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. The fungi receive sugar from the roots. In exchange, it absorbs and sends soil nutrients and water back to the plant. So it's a great example of a mutualistic relationship. When we look at bread molds, here's a bread mold with the fruiting body above ground. The name of the spore-producing structures, we never said this earlier, but the name of the spore-producing structure of bread molds is called the sporangia. So make sure you know that if you're in my biology class. If I were to ask you on a test, what do we call the spore-producing structure of bread molds? I hope you would say sporangia. Or if I were to ask you, which fungi produce their spores inside of objects called sporangia? I hope you would say the answer would be bread molds. When we look at the club fungi, here's 3 common examples of club fungi: mushrooms, puffballs, and shelf fungi. And the reason they're called club fungi, if you use your imagination, the fruiting body often resembles a club shape. Some often will describe it as kind of like an umbrella shape. So if you look at our most famous cartoon character that always carried a club, here is Bam Bam Rubble from the Flintstones. He always carried a club with him. Well, use your imagination. Do those blue fruiting bodies right there resemble clubs? How about that one? Does that does that red fruiting body resemble a club? That gray one, or brownish gray one, yeah, that kind of looks like a club to me. And let's not forget, when they grow their fruiting bodies above ground, the fruiting body structures, the spore-producing structures, will create spores through the process called meiosis. In the picture, you can see the name of the spore-producing structure. It's called the basidium. You'll see that in just a moment. Often we also see examples of club fungi that cause disease in plants. Here's 2 pictures of plants that have a fungus disease. The picture on the right shows corn smut. There's clearly something wrong with these corn kernels. Kernels of corn are not supposed to be green and big and brown and puffy like that. This corn plant in the picture has a fungus infection. The picture on the left shows leaves infected with a rust fungus. You can see how it has a rusty color to it. So club fungi can often be parasitic and cause infection. So going back to the name of the spore-producing structure, the plural version is the word Basidia. If I were to ask you on a test, what do we call the spore-producing structure of club fungi? I hope you would say Basidia. Or if I were to ask you, which fungi have spore-producing structures known as Basidia, I hope you would say club fungi. And then another group of fungi I want you to know are called the sac fungi. The picture shows yeasts, morels, and truffles as common examples. Often we even get antibiotics from sac fungi. The picture of the left shows a green mold growing on an orange. The green mold is the name penicillium. It's a mold, it's a fungus. And from this penicillium fungus, we've learned to harvest the antibiotic known as penicillin. The reason they're called sac fungi is because their fruiting bodies resemble a sac. Here's two very nice pictures showing sac. Also, their fruiting body resembles a sac, but it also will produce haploid spores by the process of meiosis, and the haploid spores are often released into the air. Many sac fungi are edible and considered a delicacy in parts of the world. The picture shows crispy veal sweetbreads filled with truffles. Looks very appetizing, very delicious. So in this picture, we have the final name of the spore-producing structure. If I were to ask you on a test, what do we call the spore-producing structure of a sac fungi? Here's your answer. The spore-producing structures of sac fungi are called asci. Asci is plural. If I were to ask you the other version of the question, if I were to say which fungi create spores in structures known as asci, I hope you would say, oh, that's the sac fungi. And when we wrap up these notes, here's a friend from a few months ago called Lichen. If you remember Lichen from our ecology chapter, we mentioned they are often called a pioneer species because they can grow on rocks. We also mentioned that they are a great example of a mutualistic relationship. Two organisms living in a close relationship where they both benefit. The two organisms are fungus and algae. And the reason this is a great example of mutualism where they both benefit is because when you look at them and you figure out what do they gain, well, the fungus, because it's a decomposer and it does external digestion, the fungus can partially digest the algae and obtain nutrients. You might think, well, isn't this a parasitic relationship because the algae is being harmed? Well, remember that algae need a home to live in. They need a moist environment. And that's one of the advantages that the algae obtains from the fungus. Moisture is trapped inside the hyphae. Also, the algae has a substance to grow upon. Algae can't really grow on bare rock, but the fungus can. And so in this case, they absolutely do both benefit. The algae could not even exist without the benefit of the fungus. Okay, so now that we've reached the end, go ahead and pause the video and try to answer these questions on a separate sheet of paper. If you're in my class, I'd be happy to check your answers either before class or after class one day. So go ahead and pause the video and try to complete these. Good luck.